Georg Möller is professor of philosophy at the University of Macau. His research focuses on social and political thought and on Chinese and comparative philosophy. He's author of You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity, The Moral Fool, A Case for Amorality, and several books on Daoist philosophy. You can find him on his popular YouTube channel, Carefree Wandering. In this conversation, we talk a lot about wokeness, its characteristics, its manifestations in regard to the culture war, the Ukraine crisis, German politics, postmodernity, and a lot more. A very fascinating talk that I hope that you very much enjoy. So my name is Tom Amarque, and this is the Parallax podcast. Thank you very much, Professor Möller, for taking your time talking with me.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
So you're in Macau now?
Yes.
University for how long? Are you there?
I came here in 2015, so I've been here for more than 7 years. And due to COVID travel restrictions, I didn't leave Macau for more than 2.5 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, yes.
I would like to come back to that later, but I would presume that, what is it, 7 years now, that kind of informed your perspective on culture war, because I myself living in Spain, and so I'm a little bit in a distance to Germany and have the privilege to look at it from outside in a kind of way. So.
Yes, of course, this has had a great influence on me. My exposure to China and East Asia and East Asian languages and cultures and philosophy. I lived in China for 2 years in the late 1980s, 1987 to 1989 as a student, when China was still very communist, because my background is Chinese studies.
Right.
I got my degree in Chinese studies. And so I've been regular. I visited China on a regular basis since then. And as I said, I already spent 2 years, the formative period of my life in my early 20s, living in Shanghai. And then later on, I left Germany in 2000. And then I lived for 9 years in Canada, and then 6 years in Ireland, and now 7 years in Macau. So basically, I spent more than half of my adult life outside of Germany,
right?
And a significant part in the Anglo-American world, and maybe even more significant part in the Chinese-speaking world.
If you had to concretize in what way you living in China had informed your kind of perspective on what's going on culturally right now, could you pinpoint that? Could you put your finger on it?
Yes, well, in my own philosophical terminology, it's this exposure to what I call a sincerity culture that is based on forming your identity in orientation to roles you have in society, particularly family roles. Which is still, I guess, the norm in Chinese-speaking countries and in many parts of East Asia. So that made me kind of suspicious of this kind of authenticity mode in which I guess most Westerners shape their identity. So that has been very much at the center of my intellectual development, this exposure to Asia and China in particular.
Right. Okay, so let's jump right in. So you mentioned sincerity, and you in your videos referred to, let's say, 3 stages. You talk about the age of sincerity, the age of authenticity, and the age of propheticity, right?
Right.
And just so we have a common ground to share, is that similar to what is commonly referred to postmodernism, modernism, and pre-modern or traditional kind of value sets or meta memes? Because
sure, there are major parallels between these sets of concepts. Absolutely.
Right. And where do they differ?
First of all, I regard it very specifically as an identity technology, as a way of shaping both individual and collective identity. That's my model that I'm working with, right? And then again, more specifically, the sincerity model is based on identification with roles. That's very specific, right? With roles and relationships that one has in society. And yeah, and then of course authenticity corresponds very much to modernity and the rise of individualism. But again, I see it as an identity technology that is as a kind of, you can also call it a kind of a narrative that is socially transmitted and adapted, and that of course has a lot to do with with the shift towards modernity, or is rooted in the shifts towards modernity. Right. And then yeah, and then of course prophilicity, what I call prophilicity, the shaping of identity in orientation to profiles, or by the curation of profiles, through the curation of profiles, has a lot to do with postmodernity. Absolutely, yes.
Right.
So it's a kind of variation of that conceptual scheme applied to the specific notion of forming a sense of selfhood.
Right. Okay. So speaking about postmodernity and identity, and sliding over to woke, you mentioned in some of your videos that you don't particularly view woke as a part of postmodernity. Did I get that right? Okay, so my question is, why is that? Why is that? Is that a phenomenon that is rooted in all of these three stages of you, or appears, or where would you localize woke?
Woke, yes. I mean, this is basically a response to Jordan Peterson, who basically came up with the idea that wokism is a mixture of Marxism and postmodernism, right? That's his kind of basic hypothesis. And I don't think that's really true, even though it's very clear that wokism borrows a lot from Marxism and postmodernism. And I wouldn't deny the kind of genealogical connections there, but it's not Marxist because it's not based on economic analysis. Therefore, I cannot really see a strong Marxist element in wokism. And then with this kind of focus on identity and identity politics, and its extreme kind of moralistic normativity focus, I also don't think it's really very much postmodernist. It's a kind of an Anglo-American misreading or misappropriation of continental postmodernism. And I think it basically is kind of, to overstate it, some form of betrayal or perversion of postmodernism.
Right. Because at one point I wanted to push back on one of these aspects, because for me, in my understanding, postmodernity is always not only characterized through a critique of what happened in modernity and the big narratives and the institutions and organizations, but also, you know, the step away from essential thinking.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So, and if we look at, you know, the pet peeve of the postmodern woke movement, which is LGBTQ and the transgender ideology, you have that strong sense that, well, there is no essence to our deepest, you know, sense of self, which is the point where feminists and transgender ideologists like clash with each other, because the feminists, of course, say, well, there is an inherent feminine quality to my being in the world, right? And so you have a core tenet of postmodernity, this transgender ideology, which is very much contra essentialism, right?
Exactly.
And so,
it's not, I would say it's not contra essentialism. For me, sorry for disagreeing with you there. The whole point is the kind of essentialism. I mean, that's what for me identity politics is, right? That identity politics somehow insist on some form of essentiality of identity. And I think postmodernity questions first and foremost an essentialist identity or any form of kind of how to say identity as a foundation for whatever political action or so that's I think that wokism is born out of identity politics and therefore essentialist.
Right.
That's how I perceive it.
Yes. Would you elaborate on that? Because again, as I understand, the idea of the transgender ideology is that I can change my identity. No?
No, I think the argument is very clearly, and I'm actually working on the subject right now with some colleagues who are psychologists working with transgender.
Right.
And so I mean, the core idea is what you hear, like the discourse, right? I mean, I was born in the wrong body, right? And like whatever, in a paper that we've just recently wrote, and it's not yet published. I wonder if it's going to be published because it's such a controversial topic. We look at it's not very well known, an American commercial TV show about a young transgender person.
Yeah.
The TV show is called Always Jane. Right. And so the idea is it's someone who is born male. The name is Jack. And then as a teenager, Jack understands that he's Jane and he's always been Jane. That's a title of the whole TV series. Right. So the idea is Jack has always been Jane and now he's or she is discovering her true self and her true identity. And that's her right? That's what transgender people have this right. In German, we have this word, the Selbstbestimmung, right? This idea that which is very much to do with the vocabulary of authenticity. That in order to allow Jane to be herself, society has to do everything to facilitate that. And therefore, from a German perspective, the German welfare state, we have to fund her transition and so forth, right? And from the American perspective, we have to produce TV shows that celebrate the expression of the selfhood of every individual. So it's I think the rhetoric that is generally used and that has been adopted in transgender is very much an expression of this kind of authenticity-based, individualism-based, actually old-fashioned, pre-postmodernist, individualist American rhetoric. That's why I cannot really. It's about sovereign individuality. The same thing that Jordan Peterson is the big thing for Jordan Peterson. There are two different, as I call it, denominations of the same Anglo-American civil religion, which is focused on sovereign individuality.
Right. Interesting.
That's why I regard them, the semantics that they use, as not postmodernist, but as very much modernist.
Okay, now we're coming to a very interesting point, a point that you're making in your videos, that wokeism is kind of related to neoliberalism, whereas neoliberalism, of course, is also a kind of modern phenomena. So the question here is, first, could you explain this correlation and this relation? And second, if you would say that maybe the original postmodern philosophy was kind of colonized by this modernistic thinking.
It's as I said, sorry for repeating myself. No. I think clearly the semantics and the ideology that is driving this Anglo-American form of wokism, which is now becoming increasingly global, is the civil religion of sovereign individuality. That seems to be obvious to me. And it's this kind of extreme individualism that is tied to the liberalism. It's kind of the left-wing liberalism, right? That you find in and then in North America in the Anglo-American
Right.
realm. And of course, that has always been tied to a right-wing, more capitalism-focused form of liberalism, which focuses very much on private property and some form of, laissez-faire market, and a kind of a politics which limits the ability of the government to, from their perspective, to interfere with the individual life, right? So that's the right-wing version of liberalism. But for me, again, they are the same. They are two just wings of the same, as I now think it has to be called, civil religion, or you can also call it a general kind of a liberal individualist ideology.
Right.
And that's how I see it. And they are both, of course, also very much appropriated by capitalism. The right wing is obvious, right, because it's about free market and private property. But we see very much how also wokism is now very much integrated into the self-profiling of huge corporations and so forth, right. Just like the Black Lives Matter movement and so forth, right? And it has a similar function, I guess, to previous function of Christianity, right? Where also the expansion of capitalism back in the 18th and 17th, 18th and 19th century was very much justified morally and religiously on the basis of spreading Christianity. And so there is this kind of messianic element that capitalism likes to embrace as part of its globalizing tendencies. And so now this kind of, because of it, the universalist and the fundamentalist elements of this individualism, the left-wing individualism ideology and civil religion lends itself as a kind of replacement of Christianity to the justification of the liberal model world, of its globalization. So it's appropriated for these very purposes, also right. by the big corporations and by the Western political forces that support the globalization of the Western corporations.
Right. And so how does it work concretely? Because on one side you have modernity, which was in itself also a reaction against, the age of sincerity or the traditional age, and wants to put a distance to that kind of age and the secular kind of scientific rational thinking, problem-solving mindset. And then on the other side, it kind of embraces the priesthood and the evangelical and the Protestant kind of preaching. Exactly. Preaching, how does that work? What is the mechanism there?
Well, I mean, it's complete secularization. This secularization process has been a very long process. Philosophically, it already goes back to basically Kant and Hegel and then Feuerbach, where we have like all Protestant German philosophers who basically set themselves apart against the Catholic Church and try to basically replace what is in essence a theological metaphysics that somehow proves the existence of God and so forth, and replaces this with a radical humanism that, and then in the end, in the case of Feuerbach, denies the existence of God altogether. And so in the end, just as Feuerbach did, you can basically cross out God and reduce the previous Christian ethics to a complete secular humanism. And I think wokism is at the end of that development.
Right. So, and that's why the activists, or lots of academics, also have this kind of Puritan kind of approach to the world, which really much resembles to me, the first Puritans came to America 1619, when preaching to the right way of life and the
a very highly symptomatic aspect of this Puritanism is the aversion against humor. right? I mean, we see now whatever comedians like David Chappelle. I don't know if you followed that, right? And so, I mean, comedians have a very hard time surviving in woke culture, right? And that's kind of, I think, a clear symptom of the Puritanism tied to this civil religion, that it really very forcefully reins in humor.
Right. Although I personally think they found a way to circumvent, that and kind of thrive on the negative critique of the Puritans.
You mean like people like David Chappelle kind of?
For example, yes. They hacked the system in a kind of way.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. I agree with that too.
Yeah.
But so there's this fight going on.
Yeah. Okay, so I have to look it up because so you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, and in one of your videos, I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Faller. That's an Austrian philosopher. He wrote a wonderful book called Erwachsenensprache, and it's about how it's in part about what you say, the loss of humor, the way we would interact in the world, like in the 70s, how we had parties at that time,
right? Yes,
how all of that kind of got lost on one side,
yes.
And that kind of developed this sensitivity, this overtly sensitivity in regard of speech patterns and wokeness. And on the other side, he also mentioned that the strange phenomenon that you're also referring to, that the original left seems to have abandoned its core values, right? And so you have, and you mentioned that you have, for example, in Germany, you have the Green Party, which were famously in the 80s against war under every circumstances.
Right.
Now it's a party that openly, wants to deliver heavy weaponry to the Ukraine. Then you have figures like, I don't know how much you follow it, Gregor Gysi, Sarah Wagenknecht, who very much still try to find solution for the class problem, but are kind of ostracized by their own leftist party.
Yes, I follow this, yes.
And that happens not only in Germany, you can see that in the United States.
Yes.
And so I would like...
I mean, you mentioned, right, sorry for interrupting you, but at the beginning of what you said, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, and they are the same examples, right? Because especially Jeremy Corbyn has this background in the working class and labor movement and stuff, and then he got like totally sidelined, and the same happened basically to Bernie Sanders, right? So it's absolutely right what you say.
What happens there? What is the mechanism there? Would you like what did happen that the Green Party did such a move, such a move that completely changed its paradigm of operating in the world? When did it happen? How did it happen? Like, what's your take on this?
That's a good question. And as academics, we always say it's a good question when we don't really know the answer right away. I think this is a long process, right? I mean, I don't know, we're roughly the same generation, I think, you and I. I still I still remember when I was a kid in the 1970s. The left was still left, and it was very much about trade unions. That was always a big thing. My parents had a little hotel, and every weekend the radical trade unions would have their seminars there and teach basically Marxism to the workers, something that is basically unimaginable today. But that was the Ford company in Cologne, one of the biggest auto plants in Germany. So as a kid, actually, I took part in some sort of these training camps by the leftist youth groups in Western Germany. So that I still remember from my own experience that the left was really left. And then I told you I lived for 2 years in China, which at that time was actually still communist, right? And actually a very well-functioning communist country, which is often forgotten. But then in the 1980s, this all changed, right? And we have this large-scale privatization, especially in Germany, the media being privatized, the public transport is being privatized, the postal service is privatized, very importantly, the energy supply is privatized. And I think that was the end. This kind of large-scale privatization basically was, and then of course we have the fall of the Soviet Union, but that was preceded by the privatization that happened under Kohl before, and then under Thatcher in England, right? It had already happened, but then it was Reagan in the United States, but there wasn't much left to privatize there, right? So I think from a kind of Marxist economic perspective, the end of the left in the West coincides with the large-scale privatization that I experienced, for instance, in Germany and in England, and that completely changed the parties on the left, right? I mean, then the Labour Party ceased, in effect, to be a Labour Party, and the SPD in Germany ceased to be a Workers' Party. And they became the same that they had been, probably that the left in the US had been. It became basically a party for teachers and academics and whatever, people who read the Spiegel, right?
Right.
And this is not the workers, this is not the trade unions. And
right.
this then was also reflected in the rise of the Green Party, which is had his roots, of course, in the kind of left, in the student movement, in the kind of also, which are not workers, right? And also in the Protestant, I remember the Protestant church was very influential at the beginning, which was leftist in Germany, right? So it's this kind of bourgeois kind of people who kind of then did what the 68 people wanted to do, namely rise through the institutions, and not only in Germany. And so, along with with the actual kind of disappearance of the working class to third world countries, also the political representation of the working class and of labor issues kind of completely disappeared. I think that would be a somewhat sensible explanation for this shift.
Right. Yes. So you, I mean, I don't know if you know the American historian Thaddeus Russell. So he talks a lot about the disdain the American left has for its working class people,
right?
And, famously, the quote of Hillary Clinton about the basket of deplorables and stuff like that.
Yes.
But now the Green Party, although more to the left, was not particularly focused on working class issues.
No, not at all. Never.
So why did that happen? So that seemed to me kind of abrupt, with the new legislation and the new Habeck is now the minister of energy. What is he now? I'm not sure.
I think economy, right?
Yeah. And so, what are the dynamics there?
I mean, they represent, as I said, they represent the teachers and they represent whatever the social workers who have a university degree and are paid state employees with a good social security network and so forth. They're all not workers anymore. So the Greens Party, the success of the Green Party as from the beginning not a workers' party, has to do with this kind of big kind of educated class that has a lot of social power in countries like Germany and especially in Germany.
Right.
I don't think there's any other country where maybe in the West, where teachers have so good salaries and where the Green Party is so big as it is in Germany, right? Because the Green Party actually struggles in most other Western countries. I think it's a unique phenomenon. I don't know that the Green Party in England, France, or Italy plays any significant role. But you have this kind of typical German, kind of people who, the teachers, as I said, and these people who are, this kind of petty bourgeois class. And this is very much represented by the Green Party.
Right. I must confess, it's still strange to me that especially those academics, they should know that we are facing enormous problems with the climate crisis, and that the strange phenomenon is, as Robert Fuller noted, that these kind of baseline problems that we have, that they're kind of excluded now for issues of identity and right pronouns and all of this. That's the kind of disconnect that I feel, because especially the academic, especially the teachers, they should be able to prioritize kind of better, which, it's like, you get what I'm saying? So we should, in my point of view, more focus on environmental problems.
We should, of course, if politics would be rational, which I don't think to an extent it is, but not election campaigns and so forth, and not the ideology that accompanies it. So it seems to me quite kind of clear, again, as I said earlier, that this kind of wokism functions as a civil religion. So it provides a mythology, an ethics, a moralist narration that is somehow appealing and that is somehow convincing to, and that is post-Christian, post-religious, that fills this vacuum, as many others have said, and that gives people again, it gives them a certain profile that, and this is why it works. Because it makes people simply feel good about themselves. Right.
Okay, so
in a moralistic way.
So what is your point of view in regard of MAGA and the rise of kind of right-wing parties? We saw that now in Sweden. We saw that now in Italy. We have MAGA already in the United States, which all seem to me kind of reaction to this woke kind of ideology, and at the same time, MAGA itself seems to be eine Ersatzreligion. What is your take on this dynamic?
Yeah, it's exactly as you say. It's just, again, the other way, the other kind of wing of the same civil religion. It comes from the same. It uses the same resources, right? And the resources are, in this case, a much less secularized Christianity, right? Where with MAGA, the emphasis on Christianity and the kind of the Christian, also in, I guess, to a much smaller extent in Western countries, there's still this, this kind of anti-Islam thing that is often tied to it, that is at least indirectly an affirmation of the Christian roots. So the tie to the Christian kind of heritage is more explicit in the right-wing thing. Nevertheless, then it also very much highlights, again, this kind of the gospel of the sovereign individual, right? So this is what the two share. But then, as you're right, I mean, as you said, the MAGA is very much doing what previously Marxism and actually fascism did, speaking to the underprivileged, right? Speaking to the workers, speaking to the poor, and it's kind of showing the hypocrisy and, as you said, the kind of unrealistic policies, whatever, connected with migration and so forth. And it shows these hypocrisies, and this is how it and it also profits from pointing out how people are getting actually kind of repressed, right? It's so in this sense, you know, people feel increasingly in the West, in Germany, for instance, right? Even in the few contacts I still have in Germany, people often feel that there is a kind of increasingly repressive social climate, that it's more difficult for people to speak up, right? It's a big, like a language police thing and so forth, and people have to be much more cautious of what they say in public. So so again, or like the big thing with the COVID thing, right? Whatever kind of it's a dialectical process where these where paradoxically, the left wing, which is no longer the working class, as we all agree, it has become the establishment. And then the right wing tries to kind of, is now somehow the subversive, more anarchist alternative.
Yes, yes. So would you elaborate on, you know, this thought policing and speech policing that you just mentioned? Like, what is your take? And that's what's so interesting, that you're speaking from Macau, you know, because, you know, you have, as far as I understand, you know, in China, all these, you know, social rating apps, I think they're just introduced in the kind of, I don't know how much that actually is implemented right now, but, you know, so what's your take on this? Where does it come from your point of view, and what in what kind of way does it show itself?
I mean, again, I think Germany is actually the most extreme case in the West, right? Because the German mainstream media are much more uniform than the mainstream media in the United States, where you have both Fox and CNN, right? And in Great Britain, otherwise you wouldn't get I mean, how does Boris Johnson get elected? Did Trump get elected? Did Meloni get elected in Italy? Simply because they still have diverse media, right? It's basically unimaginable that the AfD would be elected in Germany, and one major reason for this is that they basically have no positive representation in the mainstream media. You have to go to the whatever social media to find AfD supporters speaking up, right? So there is a very strong uniformity, especially in the German media. And also in large parts of German academics, but academics, it's more like, you know, globally the case, because in the humanities in the West have been kind of strongly kind of concur with the woke agenda. That has, I guess, many historical reasons, and but yeah. I mean, that's a kind of an obvious fact, and we see revolts against this here and there. Jordan Peterson is just one of many, many examples of academics who try to kind of protest against what they see as a kind of a limitation of free speech and a kind of increasing uniformity in the academic industry, which I think, yeah, it's clear that one reason for this is also that the academic industry has become so much of an academic industry.
Right.
That is, as I said in one of the videos, I mean, you have so many people who compete for increasingly less and less well-paid positions. So, and it is very, very clear that the only chance, you know, you have to get a job or funding is if you more or less agree with the agenda, or if you write publications. If you don't do that, it's far, far too risky. You basically have no chance of getting a job if you're like a younger person and you're not agreeing with the kind of general kind of woke agenda in the humanities and Western academics. You basically ruin your chances of being hired.
Yeah. Now, what I always find super interesting is Manufacturing Consent, the book of Noam Chomsky.
Yes, of course. That's also still very much valid.
Yeah, and especially,
but I come more from the Niklas Luhmann's side, and I think
Right.
it's much more a kind of a rather than being centrally steered by the government, it's a kind of systemic, autopoietic, self-generating mechanism.
Right. Everything we
Yes.
knew about the world, we know about mass media.
Exactly.
Yes, I love that book.
Yes, yeah, it's a great book. It's also my favorite book by Luhmann.
Yeah, yeah.
The reality of the mass media.
Exactly. And it's so strange, and I think he mentioned somewhere that media itself cannot process that very information. It is always outside of the system of telling, because the system is set up to tell stories. And what you're basically saying is that the German media, they how would Luhmann describe the German media system now?
That's a very good question. I just recently read a very short interview but it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think he would be not amused about what. I read Luhmann always as someone who's kind of very much kind of subversive of mainstream thinking. And yeah, I think he would be kind of. I think he would be disconcerted about the developments.
Right. Because in my, I mean, we're verging off the topic a little bit, but it's so interesting because in my understanding, that there also in the media there has happened a grave shift from the age of, let's say, authenticity, where media's program, let's say, or structure was to report kind of the events that happened actually in the world. And then suddenly it's confronted with the fact it's always running through filter. It's always selective. You have always cater to interest groups. You have all, and so there's, and because also of the rise of social media, and it kind of failed to adapt to the age of prophylicity or postmodernity, and by that fact became more radical in its way to present reality as they understand it. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, there is a big shift in media that happened in the past in the Western media in the past 2 decades. As you said, there were still these. I mean, media by definition is always selective, right? And media is producing, as Luhmann says, information and non-information, and there are selectors, and truth is just a minor selector of it. Usually what you report should be true, that is, but that something is true doesn't mean that it's going to be information, right? It's true that I'm drinking from this cup right now, but that doesn't become a media story, right? There are many other selectors, like and one big selector is moral relevance or scandalous, that something is scandalous, and then there are many others according to Luhmann. Nevertheless, still, in the 1970s, 80s, and I think that also changed around the same time that we have this kind of shift towards privatization. It's actually connected because the media are also being privatized. And so what happens is a kind of the mode of presentation shifts from reporting of facts to morally explaining, morally judging, setting up a moral framework. I think I have some journalist friends from the old generation here in Macau, and they tell me this, right, how this has actually changed in the teaching of journalism, right? That now it's when journalisms are taught at universities, they are basically instructed that they have, to give, so to speak, provide moral guidance through their reporting. And so that's what we see so strongly, and that is so different if you would ever watch the state media nowadays, Tagesschau whatsoever, and watch some old Tagesschau thing from like 20, 30 years ago. It's very different. And the different thing is that they always put this kind of moralizing spin on things. And that's now become...
They know they are selecting, and they have to justify their selection process. Isn't that the reason why, or...?
No, that's now they think it's their duty as a good journalist, just like in the old days, function again similar to Christianity, to, so to speak, speak truth with a capital T, right? To spread the good word, to explain to the people who are the good guys and who are the bad guys.
Right.
So this kind of moralistic political narrative has like taken over reporting on all sides. And in Germany, unfortunately, we only have one side.
Yeah.
Right? We don't have in most other countries, you have Fox and CNN, and you have similar split in most other countries. You just don't have it in Germany. You don't have a Fox side.
So now we're getting into a hard problem, or a prickly problem. I don't know what's the right expression here, because you have the media as a system, in Luhmann's terms. Then you have politics as a separate system, which is kind of structurally coupled.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and that's exactly the term. Yes,
and then you have the superstructure and whatnot. So, and then we have the Ukraine crisis. And when we take all of this together, what we're talking about now, it's like you have certain narratives around what's happening there. You have certain media reporting. You have, the left that is not the left anymore, but, became neoliberal. And so we're kind of in a pickle, really, it seems.
Yes. I mean, the Ukraine war makes it clear, right? There is no information on the war. There's only propaganda.
Right.
We have no information on the Ukraine war. We have only propaganda from all sides.
And so the problem is, and you made a video in February already, that we need to de-escalate, because the whole thing started, to escalate in February. Now you have, the Nord Stream things blew up. Everybody know who it was, but you're not supposed to talk about this, and then, at least in my point of view, and you have the partly, what is Mobilmachung in English? It's like
mobilization.
Mobilization, yes. So in Russia, but you can't, and you have the avoidance of the German government, for example, to actually talk to Putin, and to have some
I think that's horrible. I mean, we have no more. We had a word for this, and this is what the left in Germany stood for: Entspannungspolitik.
Right.
It's a German. Willy Brandt got the Nobel Prize for that, right? And that's what eventually ended somehow the Cold War, at least significantly contributed to it. And now there's no Entspannungspolitik. There's no détente policy. There's no mediation. Right, there's no even attempt. Mediation is even discredited, right? And that's that's a horrible situation. It's a horrible situation. Especially, and that's very, very regrettable that the forces of the left in the West. That's right now the most kind of dangerous thing. That in the West there is no force on the left that is taking on this traditional position of the left, which goes back to the 19th century, the anti-war position.
Right. You have like single voices. Sarah Wagenknecht. I don't know if you know Professor Gouraud, who also
even Jürgen Habermas. Habermas.
Yeah.
Yes. And he got ostracized for speaking out for peace. He had this piece in the FAZ on
something that I don't understand, that there is not a negotiation process going on for months now, that it didn't happen, and that you can't really express your sentiment without getting ostracized, as you said. And that's the weird thing that's happening. And so we are like,
and that's very dangerous. Very dangerous.
So what's your prognosis of what's going to happen?
I'm just afraid there's going to be a nuclear war. I pray it won't happen.
Right.
But I think that so far it's becoming. I don't think it's more likely than not. I still think it's more likely that there will not be nuclear war. But it's more likely that there will be nuclear war now than it was 2 months ago.
Right.
For sure.
Right. Okay, so let's shift from that Ukraine crisis to the more cultural war that we're in right now. Because what always strikes me very interesting is that you have like one particular event, and then you have two completely opposed narratives on how to interpret these events, right? So Biden did this, and so you have one side, and then you have the other side, and there seems to be a huge canyon between MAGA and woke, let's say, and so we are embroiled in this culture war that runs through families, runs through friends. You saw that you mentioned Corona. Wherever you stand, it shouldn't have destroyed families by their view of opinion, and so what is your take on where we are now, culture war wise, and where it's going to be and where it's going? Is woke something that will intensify, or will there be, let's say, Girardian sacrificial victims, so the parties can come together again? Let's say like the Queen. I found the death of the Queen quite moving, simply because of the fact that the political parties somewhat came together in the moment of mourning. Because
we're talking about the Queen.
Yeah, the Queen, and she died, and suddenly all the different political parties came together and unified in mourning, and that was kind of a moving moment, because all the polarity that was there before kind of vanished, and so that showed me like the value of the strange value of monarchy, of the British monarchy. I found that super interesting.
Well, that's a good point. Yes,
but you don't have that in the United States, because the flag is already kind of desecrated right now. It has not the power to bring the parties together.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Very good point. Yes, and I mean the only thing that brings the two parties together is the external enemy, Russia and China.
Right.
That's why I think it was so stupid by Putin, from his perspective, to start the war. I mean, the West was already in self-destruction mode, right? And he and his media were kind of definitely, trying to fuel the culture wars in the West. He could have just sat back and wait for the West to increasingly destroy itself, but instead he opted for the war, and thereby gave, at least for a kind of a temporary form of allowed the two camps in a temporary way to come together, right? In opposition to the external foe. Someone told me this story yesterday or so by a friend who lives somewhere, about a friend who lives in Arizona, in rural Arizona, which is very kind of Republican, and the friend is a Democrat, and the friend went round from door to door to do some fundraising, and said then for Ukraine, and then said, no, this was the first time actually everyone was kind of supportive of the cause, no matter if Democrat or Republican, right? So this kind of anti-Ukraine or anti-China thing brings together the factions, but we see that already falling apart in Europe, right? Where people are starting to suffer from the economic collapse, and so that may well reignite the culture wars, or maybe even more likely ignite new wars, right? Where the left and the right might come together and against the center.
So that's a provocative question. Do you think like that the support of the Ukraine is kind of an attempt of the United States to bridge, the culture war and solve the culture war? Let's again speaking in Girardian terms, that the Ukraine is kind of a sacrificial victim in order.
Yes. In the US, it clearly fulfills this function. And that's why the US one of the many reasons why the war is very much in the interest of the US. It's in the interest of the US because of this, because it heals the culture war, right? Which was big, which was like burning quite hotly. Many people were talking about potential of a civil war,
right?
And then it's good for the weapon industry. It's good for the gas export thing, right? Now Europe is buying the American gas, it's important for reaffirming geostrategically U.S. hegemony worldwide, and all the other NATO countries and so forth. They have to close ranks behind the U.S. So for the U.S., it's very, very beneficial, the whole thing.
Right. So what is the media landscape in China in regard, like how is it structured, and what is the tone in regard of what's happening there and with the United States?
Well, of course, the official media in China is the state media, and they basically reproduce the official Chinese government position, which is, of course, on the one hand friendly to Russia, right? But on the other hand, also doesn't approve, for their own reasons, of the annexation of the Ukraine, of the parts of Ukraine that are now being annexed, right? Because on principle, China is against violating sovereign borders, because that's they're not in favor of that. So, but of course, the big difference between media in China and the Western media is that the people know that it's state media, and they don't really take it fully seriously. They're very critical towards the media. The Chinese public is much more critical towards the media than the German public is towards the media.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think it's obvious. I mean, it's just like whatever. In Eastern Germany, the people were very suspicious of the media, and of course, the same is the case in China.
Right.
But of course, the Chinese also very much see the rise of anti-China sentiments all over the world. So that doesn't mean that they are not happy with how China is portrayed as a country of evil all over the world.
Right.
So it's very ambiguous, but also, I guess, if you put yourself in their shoes, easily understandable. It's not that that the Chinese people in generally believe what their own media are telling them, but they also, that doesn't necessarily make them anti-China, right? Because they're Chinese, and they also very much experienced an unprecedented economic success and an unprecedented economic rise of a very poor country to a reasonably rich country. And they very much understand that the rest of the world doesn't want them to be rich. And that's what they very clearly see. That's how they react to the West. Somehow the West isn't happy with us being as rich as the West, wanting to be as rich as the Westerners. That's, to put it very simple. And the West is very happy with Ukraine affirming its state borders and gives them all kinds of weapons. But when China tries to affirm its state borders in Hong Kong and fights a separatist movement there, then we are the devils.
Right. And so Macau itself
very much the hypocrisy. To summarize it in one sentence, the Chinese public is in general very critical towards its own state media, but it's also very critical about the hypocrisy of the West.
Right. So just to understand, Macau is a free region or of China, or is it? How would you describe that?
It's a highly autonomous region. So we have it's like Hong Kong. It was a former Portuguese colony, basically, returned to mainland China in 1999, 2 years after Hong Kong. It's very small, only 10 kilometers long, 3 kilometers wide. Has become, because of, after the takeover, one of the richest places in the world because of the casinos that have been put here. So it's the Las Vegas of China, basically, and is super rich, super small, super privileged in many ways. Has its own currency, the Macau Pataka, which is tied to the Hong Kong dollar, which in turn is tied to the US dollar. Has its own laws, has its own border. So prior to COVID, Germans, European EU citizens, Americans can all enter Macau without a visa. People from mainland China need to have a visa to go to Macau.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes.
That
Because
also means that the COVID policies weren't that crass in Macau, or were they heavily enforced?
no, they were actually this visa regulation is still in place. It's still the same. You don't need a visa as an American or EU citizen, or as a matter of fact, many countries in most countries in the world, you can travel to Macau without a visa. However, now it's one of the last places that still has quarantine in place. So that's why, because the casino industry is completely dependent on mainland Chinese tourists. So because China has a strict zero COVID policy, Macau basically has to follow the Chinese policies because if Macau would allow foreigners to enter Macau without quarantine, these people, it couldn't open the borders to mainland China.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Because then mainland Chinese would be in danger of infecting themselves with COVID here. So Macau has to make sure that Macau stays COVID free in order to keep the border to China open.
Right.
And that's why we have the strict COVID policy here. That's why I couldn't leave Macau since 2.5 years, because Macau is absolutely dependent on not having any COVID to keep its borders open, to keep its casino industry open.
Interesting.
Yes.
And so when I was mentioning the social credit system, you were kind of hesitating. Is that how much is that employed? Is there anything like it? Or is that just a rumor? Or like how would you describe the lived reality?
They tried to implement and did implement different forms, various forms in various parts of China, not in Macau. So I've actually never personally witnessed it. But again, it's also something that is kind of exaggerated by the Western media. Again, there is no such thing as the Chinese social credit system, right? It doesn't exist as one system. There are many local different systems, and they're only partial. Secondly, it's something that is not very different and probably less in effect than what we have in the West, with the supervision of data and whatever. If people have credit ratings, they have police records, they have records of everything that they purchase and so forth, right? The difference is that it's run by the government instead of private corporations. Another thing is that the Chinese people in general, including many colleagues and students, as I said, they're very critical of many things about the Chinese government and Chinese politics. They're usually not critical about the social credit system at all. They usually think it's a good thing. Because there isn't a lot of public trust in China. Also the main crime in China, unlike in the US, where the main crime is violent crime, right? And the main crime in China is fraud. And here in Macau, it's there's basically no violent crime. Sometimes a case of domestic violence, as happens everywhere in the world, but it's basically the level of violence. That's why China is such a safe place, right? But there's a lot of scamming going on. And that's something that the Chinese think is very effective to prevent scamming.
Right.
So
so it's not that what the West is kind of interpreting what the social credit system is. There's a reason why it's viewed more positively, because it has something to do with trust and with accountability.
I mean, that's what the word credit means, basically, right? Credit means credit. It comes from credibility. So it's a system, the intention of which is, of course, also surveillance, mass surveillance. But really, the primary intention is to improve, to address a very basic problem in China, that is credibility particularly in the economic sphere.
Right.
So, and generally in the public sphere.
Right.
That's why the reaction to it is widely positive. It's just like whatever the reaction in America is positive towards any kind of, mostly towards any kind of police measures that prevent violence from happening.
Right. Okay, so one last question. I think we're good. So I don't know if you ever encountered some philosophies or theories that kind of go beyond postmodernity. I mentioned, in the beginning of our talk, metamodernism and performatism, and so kind of all systems that kind of all want to go beyond, the cynicism of the postmodern stance in a kind of way, and I always like the performatist view that we can enact something as truthful, although we know that it's not, because we have to acknowledge the insights of postmodernity, but we can still act as if some things are true and beautiful,
right?
And so that's a more positivist view, which kind of integrates what came before, and so the first part of the question is if you encountered, these kind of theories, what you think of them, or what do you think where all of this with woke and MAGA and where this is going? Will that intensify? Just even if we, put the Ukraine conflict aside, so where are we going from your point? Is that conceptually and culturally?
That's a big question, but if I understood, let me address the first part of the question. Right. About this kind of narratives that we know that they are narratives, but yet we act as if they were actually true, right?
Right.
That's at the core of my understanding of Daoism, actually. I have this notion of genuine pretending. So if I may explain that briefly, we talked about these different identity technologies at the beginning: sincerity, authenticity, and prophilicity. And they are basically different kinds of forms in which we develop a sense of self, a narrative of the self, right? And they're all, constructions. They're all kind of inventions. They are all kind of mythologies. They're all kind of pretense, and pretense in English also has the meaning of play, like, playful. We play a role, and we play a certain form of selfhood. We create a profile, right? These are all forms of pretense, of make-believe. But then through this, we develop genuineness. So whatever, we play a role in the family, and then we commit to it, and then we become a genuine, loving father or mother, right? By committing to the role. Or then in the authenticity, whatever, we create this kind of self, and then we pursue this selfhood, and therefore therein we develop a sense of genuineness, right? And now that I think now we do the same thing with profiles, right? We create certain profiles, you and I, on YouTube, and we become invested in it, right? And there we find some form of genuineness. So, and I think that's just the way it is. That's the way of human existence. That's in itself not postmodern, but postmodernity is one realization of this. We also have pre-modern realizations of this in Daoism, as I said, or in Buddhism, maybe. And we also have a postmodernist realization of this kind of existential condition of genuine pretending. That genuineness is something that is somehow pretended, as paradoxical as it may sound. So therefore, the same thing, truth is something that is, so to speak, invented. And it's an invention we eventually come and must believe in. And I think there's not only nothing wrong with it, but it's also the way we've always been functioning.
Right. And so the first part of the second part of the question, yes.
So what's the second part of the question again?
So like a part, and also either if you look at the future from that kind of point of view, or even without the models, where are we going? You know, where is that all heading to? What's your prognosis on this? You know, in terms of woke and the cultural conflict we're in.
Well, again, I can only explain it then from my perspective. I think we're moving on to, we're increasingly becoming more and more prophilic. We're more and more operating in the mode of prophilicity. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or it's a bad thing. But at least I think it entails the possibility, and that would be maybe something I hope after woke, if that's possible. I'm not sure, I can't see the future, right? But just as we need some form of de-escalation and also some form of whatever new enlightenment that becomes critical of the civil religion, that we don't become fundamentalists. So both wokism and MAGA are two kind of post-Christian forms of fundamentalism. And my hope is that with the help of postmodernism and with the help of a correctly understood form of prophilicity, we can, so to speak, overcome this tendency of this fundamentalist tendency and understand the contingency of our identities, right? And that we can be more self-ironic and be more forgiving, be more tend generally to towards more ease instead of Spannung, right? So I hope that prophilicity provides at least an opportunity for this kind of general Entspannung and for this kind of general easing things up. And moving away from this kind of overly civil religious fundamentalism that has so strongly increased, right? I think that's again, like for me, this wokism thing, which unfortunately has taken over Western Europe, is comparable to a kind of uprising in fundamentalism, for instance, in the Arab world, because also the Arab world wasn't that fundamentalist in the 1970s and 60s and 80s. Right, there was all these social revolutionaries and whatever from Kemal Atatürk, and they were all secular, and then they got blown away by this kind of fundamentalist wave. And I think we're seeing something similar with wokism. And my only hope is that it somehow will go away and we become less fundamentalist.
It seems to me always when you describe it like this, I always have to think about Freud, you know, and the psychodynamics. And so, you know, because on one side, you have, of course, the ego, which kind of, you know, what's the word, organizes the superstructure, the superego and the id. Right. But the more you suppress the id, that works only for a certain amount of time. And then it erupts. Yes. You know, and it erupts with all these weird impulses and, you know, narcissism, and we want to control people. And, you know, we're projecting our fears and needs onto other people. And so you know, if you describe it like that, fundamentalism like popping up in our culture here and there in the East and the West, I wonder how much this is due to, you know, the psychodynamic that Freud.
Very good point. Very good point. Yes.
Doesn't seem rational what's happening.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes.
Professor Möller, thank you very much for taking the time. I think we got it now.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.